There it goes. Hello, everybody watching at home. This is our Christian formation time with our adult group. And today we're doing one last session on the series of Our Neighbor's Faith. It's this book right there, buddy. It's what we've been doing. We took a break from it before Advent, and then when we went online, it seemed like a good time to pick it up again. And we've been going through a few more Christian denominations and then some other world religions. We've talked about Judaism and Islam. And last week we talked about Buddhism. This week, as one last stop on the tour, we're talking about Hinduism. And if you were here last week, you might have heard me say that I kind of struggled with this one. And it just was so different. I'm not sure if it was the style of how it was written this time or probably just the concepts. They're just so different from how I've been kind of shaped through Christianity and Judaism and other things that I've learned about. This one just threw me a little for some reason. It just was harder for me to connect with it. So to that end, on your handouts, it starts with just a little reflection here. When you're talking about religion, sometimes people use the word faith as though it were interchangeable with the word religion, like a synonym. However, faith has a connotation and an implication that you have faith in something or someone. And this can apply more naturally in religions like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, where we have a relationship with and a faith in God. However, for teachings like Buddhism and Hinduism, that word doesn't fit as well. And you may have noticed, if you've been looking in this or following the handouts, that they don't talk about the Hindu faith or the Muslim faith even. They don't talk about Buddhist faith because that's not really a word that would be in their vocabulary in these different traditions. Which is to say, it's good to recognize that different religions have different goals, have different starting places, different outlooks. Christianity, we talk a lot about salvation and redemption. Well, what are we being saved or redeemed from? From our sin. Well, what if sin isn't part of your vocabulary? What if you're not worried about the sins you've committed and how that affects you later? Or maybe you'd have different terms for it. Later on, we'll hear that Hindus aren't about missionary zeal. They're not, with the exception of the stories in the 70s of the Hare Krishnas in airports and things like that, trying to just jump on people. You don't think of Hindus or Buddhists as, on the corner with their sign saying the end is near, or, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's not part of their goal. They're not out there trying to convert people. Whereas Christians might think, if we don't convert these folks, their souls might be in some state of peril. So there's just a whole different approach. And I think it's good to remember that sometimes, that if we're talking about other religions, we have to step back from our frame of reference and consider where they might be coming from. Because otherwise, how can you have the conversation if you make assumptions about what they're coming at and what we're coming at? So we can draw parallels and learn from other traditions, but we have to be conscious of our differences as well, especially with Buddhists, Hindus, when the amount of overlap is much slimmer as opposed to Jews or Muslims, where we do share some more, at least common stories or some common vocabulary. So just wanted to start with that. As we read through this one, I don't know if you've had a lot of exposure to Hinduism, if you've studied it or known people who practice it, but it's very different from Christianity in terms of its goals and its outlooks and what it's all about. So we'll see how that comes out as we read today, as we talk today. Hinduism dates back 4,000 or 5,000 years, so it predates Christianity. It puts it somewhere along Judaism in terms of its origins. Judaism doesn't have like a specific, and here's the date that the Prophet Muhammad had something like with Islam. Judaism at least goes back to 700-800 BC, maybe longer ago, but probably longer ago, but there's no the Old Testament doesn't come with a carbon dating. It doesn't come with specific dates of when things happened prior to some things like King David or the exile that you can match up in terms of who was in charge of Babylon or records about King David or things like that. So Hinduism's pretty old. It encompasses many different spiritual traditions and practices, but the various sects are unified by their reliance on ancient texts called the Vedas as the primary source of inspiration and the basis for philosophy and spiritual practice. Veda means knowledge in Sanskrit, and the Vedas are considered to be timeless truths revealed to anonymous sages. It's one of a number of traits that parallels Buddhism, in that the central unifying factor is this collection of teachings. In Buddhism, it comes from the Buddha, who was born named Siddhartha, and he encountered some various religious practices, I'm assuming some Hindu practices, and from that came to write and his writings, and that's the central basis of Buddha. Of his writings, it was the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And so that's the basis of things, not necessarily starting with creation, not necessarily starting with the flood. It starts with these teachings, and then they get into some other areas. There's not a set of doctrine like Christians might have, or things like that. It's here's these writings, and then it kind of ripples out from there. And if you think about it, both Hinduism and Buddhism came from kind of the same area geographically. Buddhism was northern India specifically, but they come from the same kind of pool. The primary philosophy based on the Vedas is called Vedanta, meaning the culmination of the Vedas, so the culmination of knowledge. There are 4 Vedas. Each one has 4 parts. In Christianity, we've got 3s and 7s and 10s as some of our important numbers. Well, Buddhism was 4 noble truths and an 8-fold path. Here we have 4 Vedas in 4 parts each. So 4 seems to be a number that stands out. The last and most philosophical part of each Veda contains the Upanishads, which are climactic texts on which the Vedantic philosophy of Hinduism is based. Everybody there with me so far? This is just the introduction. There are 3 main schools of Vedantic philosophy, categorized according to how the relationship between God, Brahman, and creation is understood. So think Lutherans, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, or something like that, like 3 main chunks, or Baptists, Protestants, and like Pentecostals, Protestants, and Catholics. Think 3 big groups of Christianity that might have some theological differences. The 3 main schools of Adantic philosophy are broken up on how they understand the relationship between God and creation. There's the school of dualism, where God and creation are considered separate. There's the school of qualified non-dualism, where creation is seen as the parts and God as the whole. So they're not separate, but they're not exactly the same. And then there's the school of non-dualism, also known as Advaita. I don't know how to pronounce things. Advaita, where God and creation are seen as united. Okay, so you have union, non-dualism, dualism, completely separate, and then qualified non-dualism, where God is the whole and creation is the parts. Each approach tries to address the universal and timeless mystery, the relationship between God, humankind, and nature. Brahman is a term common to all schools of Vedanta, used much in the same way God is used in other religious traditions. It refers to the highest, most exalted entity, the absolute. According to Vedantic philosophy, the goal of life is to establish an ultimate union with this ultimate reality. Questions, comments so far? Okay. All right. In Advaita Vedantism, which is the one where there is no separation, God and creation are one. That was taught by Shankaracharya, a 7th century philosopher saint. In this branch, God and creation are united, and this universe that we live in is an illusion of the one reality with which union is the goal. So even though it seems like the universe and God are separate, that's just an illusion. They really are one. Everything that we see and experience merely appears to be real. The power of Brahman to project this apparent reality is known as Maya. Our own ignorance causes us to perceive what we see and experience as being real, but it's all just an illusion. And this is the school of thought, this non-dualism, that we're going to talk about for most of our time today. In this school of thought, humans' true nature is divine emerging from Brahman, because we're all one. So if Brahman is divine, then so are we, because we're all one thing. We fail to realize our own divine nature because we believe what our senses tell us, taking in what seems to be finite, divided, and changing in the universe, following laws of causation. For everything, every action has a reaction. We assume that that is reality. Our genetic programming, our scientific worldview make us identify with our body and mind, makes us feel finite and separate from the rest of the universe. And that means we're subject to change and disease and death. We feel mortal, to import a different word. So the goal of life as understood by Hinduism is to see through our mistake that we're finite and realize our true nature. As seen within the illusion of space and time, we are individual souls or jivas seeking to be reunited with that absolute Brahman called the Paramatma. Okay? So if we're all one of the same substance of this Brahman, this God, then the goal in life, the process that you're going through with Hinduism, the reason you follow these teachings is to get past that feeling of being separate and finite and realize that we're all actually one with God and with one another. We're all part of this one reality. And I shrug not to dismiss this or write it off. It's just, like I said, it's so different. One thing very central to Christianity is that God is other. God created us. We are the creation. God is the creator. Jesus is unique because Jesus is fully divine and fully human. And through that both and, that simultaneous, that's where we get our salvation from. Jesus comes down and bridges the gap and saves us from our sin. But there's always this separation that God might come into our world in ways we can understand and relate to, but at the end of the day, God is still something that we cannot fully understand or grasp. God is something else. God is beyond us. Here in this branch of Hinduism, the whole idea is that no, we're all one. And the point of our existence is to try to get through this illusion and connect to and realize this oneness with the Creator. We'll get to that. Kind of. Yeah. So Brahman is considered God in the sense of the absolute, this higher power, I guess you could say, that the thing from which everything else is, or everything else is a part of. So in that respect, sure, there's God called Brahman. And then you may have heard of Hindu deities like Shiva or Ganesh, the elephant. Is that right, Ganesh? I think that's right. So you may have heard of Hindu deities, and we'll get to that in a minute. So there are these gods, this kind of pantheon of celestial beings, but it's not the same as like Greek gods or Roman gods. It's not the same as what we would talk about in Christianity. We'll get to that. There's a teaching called karma. We touched on this last week with Buddhism. Karma is karma is actions. So within this world of time and space and causation, things appear to work in certain ways. For every action, there is a reaction, including our own actions and thoughts and desires. The law of karma states that until one transcends this relative plane of existence and is united with Brahman, every action will have a reaction because we think that that's how the world works. We don't understand that it's all part of one thing, so we feel like there's like this pinball effect. That it's all relative when it's not. Our karma may not bear fruit in this life, but may be stored until a future life. Reincarnation in Buddhism was some branches talked about reincarnation to cover the balancing of the scales if your actions in this life didn't add up. Like if the rich, powerful, wonderfully blessed person was actually a terrible person, that would get sorted out later. That's how Buddhism kind of accounted for when karma scales didn't balance. There's reincarnation. In Hinduism, it's more of a given. You're going to keep getting reincarnated. You might have some times of, you may experience heavenly or hellish realms until you reincarnate, but eventually, with each repetition, eventually you're going to make it to that higher plane of existence where you realize the union with Brahman. So reincarnation is a process of gradual enlightenment towards this greater truth, or cleansing, I didn't see the word cleansing in here, but in terms of cleansing away the illusion, getting to the full, the apparent universe can be thought of, I like this, as a dream of Brahman, who has projected this universe and entered into it, just like we might enter a dream world when we sleep. When we dream, our dream world has little reality compared with our waking state. Similarly, our perception of the world has no reality when compared to the realization of God. It's like we're living in God's dream, and we don't get the whole picture because we're not the one dreaming it, but eventually we will be awakened and get into the Brahman reality where it all makes sense again. We won't get past our misperceptions of Brahman until we move beyond it, because there, such questions won't arise. We'll get it. So we don't understand that Brahman and the universe are one, but we see them as separate, dual, and we use this language of Brahman creating the world as a divine play or dream called Leela. All right. Through our lens of misperception, the one appears manifest as many. And in Hindu thinking, those manifestations often occur in pairs of opposites, male, female, dark, light, things like that. They tried to use this example, this illustration. Think of Brahman like a stringed instrument. Music is the creation. The vibrations of the sound occur equally in opposite directions. If you strum something, the sound ripples out. The vibrations resonate differently on different planes. So if you think there's the world, very common, then there's our minds, our mentality, where maybe we're starting to clue into things. But then there's the heavenly places. One note is played, but it's like octaves on a piano. It's the same wavelength, but registering on different levels. So if you have a C and then a low C and a high C, it's all C, but it's registering on different levels. So that would be one way to think of how this Brahman stuff plays out in terms of how we perceive it. Some of the Hindu gods and goddesses that you have heard of are products of these dualities. So Rama, Sita, Krishna, Radha. There are many more. Some sects see the god-goddess pairs to personify the three aspects of the manifest world: creation, preservation, and destruction. If you've learned anything about Hindu mythology, the Hindu gods and goddesses, you'll hear a lot about creation, destruction, preservation. So you start it, you keep it going, and then it ends. Creation, preservation, destruction. Other sects see all three aspects in one deity, which, it's not the same as the Trinity. one God and three persons, but there's some of this both and stuff going on. Whatever the case, all the various gods and goddesses of Hinduism are but aspects of Brahman seen through different Maya, different projection. So that's how it's a little different from Greek or Roman. Each god and goddess is its own thing. You can trace the family tree. In Hindu thinking, Brahman is one, and you might get to know Brahman through these various other deities, but they're still all part of the one. Our true nature is infinite, undivided, and unchanging. So we naturally seek to find those qualities within this world. We yearn for freedom, love, and peace, which is respectively looking for the infinite, undivided, and unchanging nature. In this world, though, the more we get of one of those three, freedom, love, and peace, the less we get of the other two. Only through spiritual practices can one wake up to their lost nature and find absolute freedom, love, and peace. Hinduism recognizes that all religious paths can lead one to God, and all the seeming contradictions disappear once the goal is realized. You remember in Buddhism last week, a lot of it was about suffering. Suffering is a noble truth. There is suffering in life. You're not immune to it. We suffer because we're attached to our idea of the way things should be. But there is an end to suffering, and the end to suffering is through these practices, the Eightfold Path. There's some parallels here. We're going to always be searching and seeking for the truth of life and never getting it quite right. We're always going to be looking for freedom and love and peace until we reach that stage of realization that all is one. We're always going to be feeling, coming up short until we wake up. And there are spiritual practices and meditation to help you get to that plane of realization. Here's some general advice on how to wake up. Remember that your true nature is divine, and that after a series of life cycles through reincarnation, you will reach your goal. Accept yourself where you are and go forward from there. Choose the path that best fits your temperament and your natural inclinations, and give your activities a spiritual turn. The goal is to realize or attain your oneness with God, and the two main obstacles are forgetting that the world is God in disguise and getting distracted, and letting your ego think that you are separate and different from others. There's a little, maybe, Christian conversation that could be had there. We talk about how everybody's created in the image of God, that you do unto your neighbor as you would have them do unto you. It's not the same as saying we're all one, but maybe our egos still keep us from thinking that we love everybody on the same level as ourselves. There are entry points for conversation, but the vocabulary and everything else is different. But we still have places where we can have conversations. Spiritual practices or yogas help one realize their truth. Now, this did not talk about the yoga body stretching and things like that, hot yoga, anything like that maybe you associate with the word. But the four main common yogas were karma yoga, pursuing the path of selfless action; jnana yoga, affirming your true nature, maybe by repeating some mantras to yourself; bhakti yoga, which is developing a loving relationship with a personal aspect of God, relating everything in your life to your chosen deity, performing ceremonies called puja or worship. Come back to that in a second. And the fourth one was Raja Yoga, gaining control over the mind through meditation and other mantras. I want to stop here for a second. So think Bhakti Yoga. So all those different Hindu gods and goddesses that you've heard of, they're all aspects of the one Brahman. So you can pick one of those, the one that you relate to the most, and that's the one you worship. You might have a shrine in your house. You might go to a temple dedicated to that god or goddess. And that is one spiritual practice, one path of finding your union with the one, with creation, by finding one aspect to relate to. Because everybody needs a starting place. So if you see in a business that has a Hindu proprietor a little shrine or a little statue, that might be their chosen deity. That might be their Bhakti yoga.
What does it look like? I know what the Buddha looks like.
So if you think, I think it's Shiva who has the 6 arms. There's the one with the head of an elephant. There's a whole rich mythology of different Hindu gods.
The one's called the dragon. Dragon? Oh no.
I don't know.
I don't know. I've seen one in a nail shop we walked in. Maybe it was the one with lots of arms.
Could be. And I kind of wish that they would have gone into that stuff here, but what I learned was those are sort of secondary. You know, I would think like Greek gods, Roman gods, oh, Hindu gods, which one do you worship? What parts of life do they have influence over? But apparently that's secondary to Brahman in terms of Hindu teaching.
There was a group in the early 19th century in India that was giving British a real hard time. And they were, I can't remember, Shiva, I think that was one, which was destruction, part of this phase. They'd go around and murder people. And so they were following that one because that's what they thought they needed. So they had a lot of problems with those a long time. It was a cult that would kill people on the road, and it was part of their religion. So, and they had, it's called Shiva. And that one had a lot of arms too, if I'm not mistaken.
So if you were here last week, we were talking about Buddhism, and we said that another thing Buddhism and Hinduism have in common is that they're not, here's the teaching, everybody has to adapt to this wherever it goes. Every country, every culture that Hinduism found its way to, Hinduism would kind of adapt to those people, or the people would adapt it to work for them. There were certain things that were essential still, but it's a lot more malleable than things like Islam or Christianity. So that means that as Buddhism or Hinduism, started in India, but if you go to different places where Hindus practice, Hinduism in America is going to look different too. You do get different interpretations, and you're going to get some groups that say, yes, murdering people is the way to go. That's how we eliminate these distractions to find unity. Just like you have kind of militant or extreme pieces within Christianity or Islam that don't represent the whole.
I didn't quite understand what that was all about until you read that point where there's 3 phases. There was the beginning, preservation, and destruction. Depending which God you pick, that's what you follow.
And if you think to yourself, people are just going to get reincarnated anyway, maybe that lessens some of the moral implications. But within Hinduism, there are still teachings on how you should treat your neighbor and how you should, operate in life. Just again, it's not so that you're, racking up points in heaven so that you're saved, or it's not so that you're following the law like in Judaism so that you're, putting forth that you are God's people by following these laws and being a light to the nations. It's all just about, certain practices so that you find unity with Brahman, so that you treat others with unity and with fairness and with equality and love, so that you're showing the oneness that you have. Yeah.
But they take that reincarnation to another level in the caste system. So,
yes. That's the other thing I was going to say. Yeah.
They take that to another level. You come back as a human, but it's
a bug.
Lowland human, and then you come up with a second level. Or you come back as a cockroach, depending on what kind of bad person you were in the life last time. So you can either go forward or backwards.
So I was trying to get there and I sidetracked myself. So each culture that Hinduism is a part of has an effect on how it plays out. So if you think in India, they had this caste system, and depending on the color of your skin or your status economically or your job, there was very, very, these are the best, the really dark-skinned folks were the untouchables, they were on the bottom. And so that caste system could play out in terms of how your religion played out too. As opposed to your religion affecting your culture, the culture had a big impact on your religion. So yeah, that throws a wrench in the works too, in terms of trying to understand all of this. Maybe Hinduism and Buddhism are more difficult to understand because each culture kind of has its own stamp on the religion, and so it's very easy to take the culture and the religion and get them kind of blurred. And that, I mean, to be honest, that can happen within Christianity too. I mean, if you think of Celtic Christians in Ireland, you don't think of the same thing as, you know, the Bible Belt in America. You know, you think Episcopalian. If you think Midwestern Lutheran culture, it doesn't come out the same as, you know, East Coast Episcopalians, you know, smells and bells and worship and things like that.
Smells and bells.
That's what Liz calls it. I don't know where she picked it up from, but that's what she's always. So, and we're going to touch on the caste system in a minute too.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's good. I wanted to get to that. That's one of the, I said last week, I had a hard time making this handout because it's just, blah, there's just a lot of information and a lot of heavy, dense stuff. This is my third time going through it, and I feel like talking about it's giving me a better sense of things. So, where were we?
I just say thank God for Christianity. I mean,
And you know, to folks who grew up in Hindu practice and culture or Buddhist, they might look at Christianity and go, "What in the heck? What is this? You know, what are you doing?" Right. But that's what I said at the beginning. If this is all you've ever known, you're used to it. And they might look at Christianity and go, "Your God was killed on a cross and you eat his body and blood? Like what? What are you doing?" So it really, you know, to have conversations with folks from other religious backgrounds, you do have to be able to take a step back and say, okay, where are you coming from? Let me listen. Here's where I'm coming from. I'll try to explain it the best I can. And then you find wherever the conversation points are. But it's a lot different than a Christian talking with somebody who grew up Jewish or somebody who grew up Muslim. We don't have as much shared ancestry like Abraham or you know, David or things like that. We have the Old Testament as part of our Bible. You know, they would say this is the Bible, it's the Hebrew Bible. But you know, we have the extra testament added on, but the New Testament makes no sense without the Old Testament, because Jesus was Jewish, he's fulfilling these prophecies, he's referring back to these scriptures, he's quoting Psalms. Like, you know, we have conversation aplenty with you know, folks from a Jewish background. Okay, that was the first branch of Hinduism. I'm not going to go into that much detail on the other two branches. They didn't in here, so I'm not either. So all of this was the Advaita, non-dualistic school of Vedanta. Remember, the others were qualified non-dualism. Rather than thinking that you are one with God, you think you're part of God, like the spark from a fire. And then there's dualism. You and God are separate. The goal is to just be eternally in God's presence. Sometimes Hinduism is divided into groups on these three lines. Sometimes it's divided into groups in terms of which deity is the primary focus of worship, even though, like you said, the Shiva group, but even though all deities are manifestations of the one absolute Brahman, they might get divided up in terms of which is their go-to deity. Another variation on Advaita Vedanta is called Tantra, where this world is seen as nothing but Shakti, which is the power of Brahman. So not just the dream being projected, but the power of Brahman is the realm in which we live, and Brahman is a disguise to be worshipped as the divine mother. So in some branches of Hinduism, the feminine is the primary and you worship the divine mother, but it all comes back to the one Brahman. Hinduism, shock, is not a centrally organized religion. It didn't start from one person or group that others broke away from, like Lutherans and the Reformation. Many Hindu temples are independent entities. There's not like a denomination. Traditionally, study of the scriptures was done by independent teachers called gurus, who had experienced God in a transcendental way and would then offer initiation into certain spiritual practices. So Liz and I were watching the Beatles documentary, the what's it called? shoot, not Let It Be. I can't think of what it's called now. It's on Disney Plus. It's like 9 hours of uncut footage of the Beatles recording an album. It's amazing to see them create this stuff on the fly. Like, wait, that's not the words to that song. Well, they didn't have the words yet. But part of the storyline in the documentary is there was this tension, not between Paul and John so much that people always talk about, like Yoko's just sitting there reading a magazine, but there was tension between George and the rest of the group because John and Paul knew each other longer, wrote all these songs together. George came onto the band at one point, but he started to have his own independent thoughts. He wanted to write his own music, and they didn't always take his suggestions. At one point, he even just leaves the band, and they spend a week trying to talk him back into coming back to finish the recordings. Well, part of this was, if you know much about the Beatles, George got really into some teachings from India. The whole band went to visit a guru. They spent some time at his compound. They show some of the film from that. That was a big deal in the 60s and in the 70s. A lot of folks took pilgrimages to India to learn from these gurus, to be exposed to these teachings, to get a better understanding of the universe, right? And so one of the opening scenes, there's a monk sitting off to the side in the recording area in orange, in an orange robe, just kind of sitting there. He's George's friend. He's just hanging out off to the side while George is recording. So you'd go and find this guru, or the guru would come to America, and they had this experience, this transcendent experience, and they would be available to anybody who wanted to learn from what they learned. And they'd pass on their knowledge and they'd teach these spiritual practices. And that was how the teachings spread. That's one example. Maybe you know others.
Well, George is the only one who stayed at Hindu until he died.
Yeah. I mean,
he was the only one. The rest of them kind of faded away from him. He stayed with it.
One of his biggest hits was it My Sweet Love? And part of the chorus, it just repeats and repeats in the background. You hear him going, Hare Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. If you've ever listened to that song, it's variations on Hare Krishna, which Krishna is a Hindu deity. And so, yeah, it really affected him. It really stayed with him. Yeah, in the 70s, you can hear a lot of Hindu influence in some of the big bands because they were going over to India. It was not, I won't call it a fad, but it was a sensation that was drawing people in.
That's what was in the, that's the group in all the airports.
Yeah. So let's see, that's next. So these independent gurus. So it was primarily one group of Hindus. This is the caste system. The Brahman caste of India, they were the upper caste. Did you know that Brahman meant God, the creator, the absolute? Well, let's name our caste after Brahman. We're the upper echelons. The Brahman caste was responsible for learning the scriptures. Well, gee, think about, there's another parallel maybe. Think about Luther's day. The Catholic elites were raising money and you doing indulgences to build bigger churches down in Rome. And some of the poorer people said, we don't want to do this anymore. This is taking advantage of us. Well, if you look at the history of India, some of the lower castes were trying to fight for equal rights, better treatment. And, you know, here's the religious elite up here saying, no, according to these teachings, that's not what you deserve. That's not how it's supposed to go. So humans, whatever religion we're in, have this tendency to divide ourselves into the upper and lower. And religion usually, on the one hand, fights to smooth that out. And on the other hand, there are those who use religion to justify the separation and say, no, this is the way it's supposed to be. But so that's in terms of Hindu worship. There's these gurus, independent temples. It's kind of individualistic. Each group does their own thing. And then most Hindu homes have a family shrine with their chosen deity that could be worshipped every day. So you might go to a temple or you might just have a shrine. It's very much as you make it. There are some Hindu organizations with centers throughout India and the world, the Ramakrishna Order being one of the largest. It was inspired by Sri Ramakrishna, who lived from 1836 to 1886, lived in Bengal, India. He followed all paths already discussed, as well as Christian and Islamic traditions. And he realized the same oneness with God through each, proving that the same goal can be reached by various paths. And so he drew this big following that whatever path you take, you can get to the oneness with Brahman. There are 15 centers in the US headed by swamis. It's another kind of form of teacher, wise person, sage of the Ramakrishna Order. They were founded by Swami Vivekananda, who lived from 1863 to 1902, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna. So here's a group. He had a following, he had disciples, they spread, they opened other centers to do this teaching bit. There was the Hare Krishna group, who were much more out there, who were in the airports. If you've ever watched the movie Airplane, there's this famous scene of the guy trying to make it to the plane in time and bowling through people like a football running back and knocking over the Hare Krishnas who were trying to give them flowers or necklaces or whatever.
Sell you books.
Sell you books. So just to keep going, think back to the different goals of different religions discussed at the beginning. Hinduism accepts all traditions as valid approaches to God. Well, so most Hindu groups don't have this missionary zeal like some Christians do. Hindus aren't necessarily sending people to other parts of the world to convert people, to make them believe like Hindus do, but they would go to other parts of the world to say, we've experienced this transcendental experience. We'd like to share it with whoever wants to. Here's our center. You can come and hear our teachings. We'll teach you spiritual practices. It's a little bit different than Christians going to Africa or South America or converting the heathens or anything like that. Or the story I've told before about the church sitting on the corner by Disneyland playing a recording about how you're going to hell and Jesus' blood will save you. We're not Hindus don't have that mindset. We're not trying to convert anybody, but we do want to share what we've learned because that is the right thing to do. Vedantic philosophy is adaptable to any culture and country. Statistics. As of 2010, there were 641,186 practicing Hindus in the US and 1,625 congregations, compared to the ELCA, 4.1 million and 9,800 congregations. So even though it's a giant religion in the world, especially in India, which is the most populous country or second most populous? Which is more, India or China?
India, I think.
Yeah.
I know they have a larger army.
Yeah. So the most populous country in the world, there's a lot of Hindus in the world. Not quite as many in our country. Like with Buddhism last week, there is so much variety and autonomy within Hindu schools of thought and practices. There isn't like a denominational website I could point you to. So the same caution I gave last week, if you want to dig deeper into Hinduism, just make sure you check your sources first before you dig too deep. Make sure it's just something sharing information and not anything with a specific agenda or slant one group against another, anything like that. So just check the about page first.
I always had the feeling that anybody wanted to be a shaman or what's the term?
A guru.
A guru. All you have to do is just get a bunch of people to believe in you. There's nothing that says you couldn't. It's like storefront churches.
Sure. Yeah.
I was gonna say that just sounds like a little public.
Yeah. Storefront churches. Yeah.
And depending on what you're teaching,
How good your charisma is,
that'll determine some of the success of what you're trying to impart. There are about six, half a dozen Hindu centers that show up if you do a map search of the Greater Richmond area. There's also another one that was I don't know how to pronounce it, Jainism, Jain. That's a whole nother religion that is not even in this book. So there's still a lot of religions, Shintoism, Jainism, Taoism. There's still a lot of other groups from Southeast Asia, Eastern Asia. We didn't get to any of the sort of animistic, it's called, like kind of nature worship stuff that you might find in Africa or Japan. We didn't get into anything from like Central or South America and those ancient cultures, Mayan, Incan, Aztec, that kind of got decimated, that were decimated when Europeans came in with smallpox and and swords and things like that. So there's still a lot out there. This is trying to cover the major ones within Christianity and the big ones in the world. But if I don't know, I think I asked this before. Did anybody have any experience? Have you ever been to a Hindu temple? Do you know any Hindus from your workplace or in your life?
My heart doctor is a turban wearer. What are they?
Oh,
Sikhs.
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 Yeah.
He's a Sikh.
Which is a whole nother religion. Yeah. And they get lumped in with, folks will see somebody in a turban and they might be Sikh, but they'll get lumped in with Hindus or with Muslims because people just don't take the time to differentiate, that there's different groups in the world.
Yeah. The Sikhs were in India were pretty much soldiers for the British.
Okay.
And I think it was a Sikh who killed Mahatma Gandhi. I think it was a Sikh who killed him.
Britain's got a lot of history in terms of getting one native group or one colonized group to turn against another. If you look at American history, different Native American tribes sided with different groups because all of a sudden they get drawn into these conflicts and they got to pick a side. They got to figure out, well, what's best for our survival. And so it's easy for the British folks to come in and say, let's get these folks to do our work for us.
In your research and how looking into this, I know the purpose is kind of, if there's reincarnation and coming to that sense of oneness, what happens once you feel that sense of oneness? Yeah, but then, okay, so
Then
you
you've moved past this realm, this plane, and you're not worried about anything anymore. You're not asking questions. You're not trying to figure things out. You're one.
Never going to come back.
Yeah, you've attained it. You made it.
Yeah. We'll never reincarnate.
I don't know what the practice is, but Ray has talked about different funerals, that they have, and some of them they burn the body, some of
Sure.
them, different religions do really different things at burial and funeral times.
Well, in the Hindu religion,
And I can't remember whether he said Hindu or Buddhist or
yeah,
whatever.
and then years ago, last centuries, 2 centuries before, they burn the bodies immediately after death because that let the spirit release to go to the next level, if it could, or reverse itself.
Which
It's
one
actually,
is that?
probably in the 1800s or something.
Yeah, but I mean, with those.
They still do it. They still burn at the river.
Buddhists, who are
No,
they?
Hindus, and they still burn their bodies at the sacred river, which they have to go into. But what I find really screwy about Hindu, that you can not just always go forward, you can actually reverse.
Sure.
You can go the other direction. If you screwed up real bad, you can go back and start over. So, but they would release their energies to the next generation where they're going. But what I found really unique is their wives would go with them. In other words, they would not be dead. They would get on the fire alive and burn with the body.
Is that like where did you learn this from? I just want to see if it's like a local practice or it's across.
That's something I learned when I was a student.
Okay.
But the wives would go with the husbands, which I thought was really odd. Because I didn't think that made any difference as far as Hindus go, because they were separate.
Mhm.
You were separate things, but the wives were burn with them.
So this is the kind of thing, like whatever you've learned, like, well, yeah, and a lot of folks base their knowledge of Hinduism on the character of Apu from The Simpsons, and they've taken some flack from that for saying, well, he's a stereotype, and people think that's what all Hindus are. And
No.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to this because there aren't a lot of Hindus in our country. We hear stories second or third hand, or we learned things that maybe were not the most accurate, or maybe they were, but things have changed. So I do encourage you, especially with Hinduism and Buddhism, do a little more digging, see what you can find. This is the surface level, but just be careful on, like I said, where your sources are.
Yeah, burning their wives.
I don't think that's
Thing of the
illegal.
past now. Because, governments have a lot of things on that.
Sure.
You can't do that. Originally it did. Wives were burned with them.
Yeah. And so anecdotally, I know that the Ganges is a holy river.
Yep.
That doesn't show up in here. Why is it holy? I don't know. I know there's issues with bringing bodies to the Ganges because that pollutes the water. That's a major, watershed for the whole area. I know elephants are considered to be sacred. I know cows are considered to be off limits. None of that is in here. How much of that is cultural? How much of it is religious? All of this. So this scratches the surface,
In some cases.
and it doesn't.
nothing.
Yeah, and it doesn't get into all of these specifics.
Well, the word karma came up, we hear that word all the time.
Oh, sure.
I'm not sure that's the same, I'm not sure what karma is, hear that word a lot.
It's a corruption of this.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's a major corruption of this. What it is.
Yeah. That'd be like, it'd be like somebody on Instagram going, #blessed. Like, well, what do you mean by blessed? Do you mean that it's like Abraham, who was blessed to be a blessing, who's part of a covenant with God, and his descendants will number more than the sands on the beach? Or does it just mean that you got, a nice stove in your kitchen? Like, what does blessed mean? If you really look at it where it comes from in the Old Testament, it's probably not exactly the same as people who just throw the word around.
Yeah, term of karma in our country means that you get what you deserve.
Right.
Well, that's kind of a way off expression of what they were
Yeah.
talking about here. So
Yeah. Let's see. We've got to wrap this up. Comparison. I'm not going to go over the comparison today. I think we kind of covered it.
isn't there?
Well, I mean, there's certain things like number 2 here. Hinduism believes the universe is an illusion, a misperception of the one reality that is Brahman. Lutheran Christians believe all things are created by God and are subject to God. God is separate from creation, which includes humans. But we would say we're created in the image of God, and we're stewards of creation. But I think that would be an entry point to a deeper conversation. Hinduism, number 3, believes the goal in life is to realize that we are one with Brahman. Lutheran Christians, we teach that we are alienated from God, but through Christ's death and resurrection, we're saved and brought back to God. So, okay, is there some conversation that could be had there in terms of finding, if not unity with God, reconciliation with God? That could be a conversation. Number 5, teach that the path to realizing our oneness with Brahman may take many lifetimes, in which we may take many forms. We teach that we're created as unique humans and we have one earthly life, the end. What could Lutherans learn? By placing Hinduism as a kind of a mirror alongside Lutheran Christianity, it may help us better articulate our own sense of the relationship between creator and created. Imagine you're sitting in a room with somebody who only knows Hindu thought. How the heck would you try to explain Christianity? How would you talk about this relationship that we have between creator and created? So by learning about this very different way of thinking of it, it could help us articulate our own way better. If we actually sat down and tried to have a conversation.
I can see Hindu why people what look this one is
Appealing?
yeah, it would make it look opportunistic because you can do no wrong. You keep going the way you are, you're not good enough, you get a second shot next time around.
Sure.
So it's an easy religion.
But like you said, it might be the opposite direction. There might be some hellish stuff that you have to go through. So your incentive is still to try to work towards that enlightenment.
But you have more than one shot. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. That if you've only grown up here in Christianity as fire and brimstone and do these things or else you're going to hell, then hearing that you have a lot of chances to work at it and get it right. There's a show called The Good Place. It's a sitcom. It was on 4 years. It's an amazing show. It's so funny and it's very philosophical. And it takes a lot of different religions and rolls it up in one and doesn't say this is the right path, but kind of wrestles with it. And they have a kind of it's not reincarnation, but they do have a sort of how do you get better? It's almost like a purgatory. You purify away your mistakes until you reach this higher level. I don't want to give it away because it's an amazing show. Yeah. And then number 2, some branches of Christianity seem to focus on one conversion experience in their past that defines the rest of their lives. For Lutherans, that could be your confirmation day. For a lot of other Christians, it's the day you accepted Jesus Christ and were baptized. But it's that one moment that is like the anchor of your faith. I think Christians might learn something from Hindus when it comes to their religious journey being a lifelong search for understanding and enlightenment. I think a lot of Christians feel, maybe not us in this room, but feel like, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here in a class. But if you feel like, you got to get it right, and as soon as that one day happens, you're good. You're golden. You made it into heaven, and I'm done. I don't need to do anymore. I don't need to get deeper. I don't need to ponder things. And I've met people who've said that. Everything I needed to learn about being Christian, I learned in kindergarten. Love your neighbor. I'm good. Well, I think there's something to be said for seeing Christianity too as a lifelong journey. Some Christians do, not all.
That community Bible study I started last week, I don't know whether people or not, but, there's quite a Baptist. One of them mentioned he went to some kind of when he was 16, what do they call it, when the preachers come in and do the
Revival?
well, yeah, and there was a fire and brimstone, everybody wasn't helping. And he immediately accepted God, and I just can't swallow that. I can see, we were talking about study. I've been in a lot of conferences, retreats, where you have a hub and you come out feeling really, really good. But then you go back to regular life and it kind of comes down. It's like for them, it's like a one-shot thing, and now it's all over. I'm saying I don't do
you might backslide, you might fall off the path, but
So then you go to the next revival, get yourself back up.
I mean, we can read books and can get someone on the high, we can go to retreat and stuff,
sure.
but I just don't get that it's a one-shot thing.
Yeah, so I do appreciate that in this tradition, your life of not faith, but your religious life is a lifelong search for understanding and
I'm
enlightenment.
a teacher for a lifelong learner.
Exactly.
My wife, when we were just kids, when I was in the service, in the 70s, went to a Billy Graham concert. I said concert, that's a wrong word. A Billy Graham meeting at the Coliseum in Norfolk. And afterwards, he brings everybody down. I didn't go, so I was and very proud of it. And so I stayed home. She went and she was talking about when she got back. And he's a good speaker. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, yeah.
He's got a lot of good things. But the part that I took umbrage to was at the end when if you felt like you were being saved or something, everybody had to go down in front and had all these counselors, I guess is a better way to put it. And they would save you.
Yeah.
These counselors would bring you to Christ. And I thought, they don't have the right to do that. I was upset with that. I still am to this day.
I can tell.
They don't know you from Adam, if I can use that expression. And
Yeah.
And they see you one time,
Sure.
and that they can bring you to Christ. What gives them that authority? I had a real hard time with that. I was a heathen then. I just definitely couldn't understand it. And I still don't today how that can work.
I think that sounds like a good conversation for another time. Unfortunately, we have to go, but yeah, that whole thing about conversion and how that all works, we could get into that.
We hear that a lot in the South.
Yeah,
but
I never heard of that noise.
No.
She would guess we would never say that way.
she came home. She came home really enthralled and
Sure.
It
Yeah.
lasted about 2 days.
Yeah. You brought her down, didn't you, Roger?
I must have brought her back down to reality. But I still to this day don't see how they have.
Well, I just as a final word, I do hope that throughout all of these different conversations and it's very light, thin exposures to other Christian denominations, other religions, that you picked up some things like looking in a mirror and seeing ourselves reflected back alongside of them. I hope this was a learning experience. I hope that you have a chance to visit some other places to learn a little more and dig a little deeper. I know I've done a course like this a few times. I did some groups this time that I've never talked about before. And every time I talk about this, I learn some new things and I think to myself, I wouldn't mind experiencing this, not just thinking and talking about it, but maybe having an experience. Having new experiences is always a good thing, even if it rubs you the wrong way a little bit, you learn from those things. And so I hope this encourages you to have more
One thing
experiences.
that people get out of Hindus is meditation, where it's sort of like
Yeah.
gray noise, where everything is shut down around you. It gives you, and it does have the tendency to
Oh, sure.
lower your heart rate and blood pressure.
Yeah.
So that part does work for you.
Oh, totally. And there's Christian
So-
meditation too, sometimes borrowing from Buddhist and Hindu traditions and adapting it to Christian stuff.
So it does bring in some white noise and just brings it down.
Yeah.
So, like on television now, they got these moments of quietness, and they got pictures of floating rivers, and they got
Sure.
and they got this one that's a polar bear with her two cubs right on top of her, and they just look back at one or two. So there is
helps you
there is something about that portion of it that
Oh,
we
yeah.
can learn from.
Totally.
Did you want to say something?
Well, sure. And it also, sure, and it helps you give a better appreciation for your own tradition. Well, let's close with a word of prayer. Yeah. All right. Almighty and eternal God, gather into your embrace all those who call out to you under different names. Bring an end to fighting between religions and make us more faithful witnesses of the love made known to us in your Son. We especially pray today for our sisters and brothers in the community of Hinduism. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. All right. Thanks for watching.